What's up, everybody? This is Passion 9, and I want to talk about one of my all-time favorite sweeping fantasy anime from Gundam Studio Sunrise, The Vision of Escaflowne. Escaflowne being Latin for escalation, apparently, so the title would be The Vision of Escalation, if you will. One of my favorite 90s anime, if not one of my favorite anime ever, honestly. I absolutely adore this show. It was put out by, again, Studio Sunrise. They've most prolifically known for Gundam, Mobile Suit Gundam, which was a show back in the 80s that really kind of redefined the giant robot mecha genre. So, they are best known for that series. Gundam, of course, came in many forms and is still around to this day in some form or another. But for me, honestly, when I think of Sunrise, when I think of Studio Sunrise, the thing I love the most is this show, is Vision of Escaflowne, which takes some of their hallmarks, which, of course, giant robots. Vision of Escaflowne does have giant robots, but again, it's a sweeping fantasy anime. So rather than futuristic sci-fi, the giant robots in this show are steampunk. They're more. They look like these fantastical mechanical robots rather than futuristic sci-fi. They're essentially giant colossal suits of armor, mechanized suits of armor that the humans pilot. And our story revolves around a teenage girl named Hitomi who gets spirited away from her world, which is actually a lot like our world. It's essentially the real world, to a fantasy world. A very Final Fantasy-esque fantasy world with airships and again, very steampunky technology. If you've played Final Fantasy VI, you'll have a good idea of kind of what this world looks like. It's very much in that sense. In fact, if there was ever an anime that kind of reminded me of a classic Final Fantasy game, it would be this one. So, if you haven't been on this yet, and you're a fan of that stuff, you should be. So, it's also kind of an early example of the isekai genre, before that became the obnoxiously saturated thing it is now. Because we have a teenage girl from our world, from an ordinary world, that is transported to a fantastical fantasy setting. But in this case, it's not because of some, online game or something. It's because she has a destiny. She is spirited away to this world called Gaia, fittingly enough, to fulfill a prophecy that she herself is not aware of. Now, before you think, oh god, not another one of those, don't worry, there's plenty of unique hooks that this show has that makes it stand out from, your typical medieval fantasy thing. For one thing, again, the mechanized armored knights that the characters pilot are unlike anything I've seen in any other anime, or certainly most fiction. They are unique and interesting as a concept. In that, again, unlike Gundams or whatever, they're like these giant hulking steampunk mechanical knights with giant swords and flowing capes and everything that feel like a combination of tech and magic rather than science fiction. And the main pilot of the show, of these things, is Vaughn, Prince Vaughn, who early in the story has his kingdom destroyed by this dark, seedy empire, regime, whatever you want to call it, the Zybok Empire, that he kills his father and destroys his kingdom right around the time Hitomi shows up to his world and to his kingdom, just like a day before. And thanks to her own unique powers, Vaughn is able to leave his kingdom, pilot this Guy Malef, this powerful hulking mechanized weapon, and together they embark on an adventure to save other kingdoms from the same fate, and their whole realm from the Zybok Empire. Because Hitomi is a mystic. She has divination powers. Even before coming to this fantasy world, she is something of a fortune teller. Other classmates would come to her and get their fortunes told, and she's like the weird fortune teller girl in her own world. So she comes to the world of Gaia, Vaughn's world, and during this war, and her divination powers end up aiding him in his battle to retake uh, the entire realm from from the Zybok Empire. So she is this mystic character. They call Earth, where she comes from, the Mystic Moon. So like you can see Earth from their world in the stars, and it's like, oh, okay, so it's like to them she's from another world. She's from a mystical world. So there is that element there. She's sort of treated as this prophetic character, by these people, even though to her she's just a schoolgirl with these like, this little divination ability. And Meryl is a cat girl that is a longtime friends with Vaughn. The show has one of the best cat girls, right up there with Aisha Clan from Outlaw Star and Hanakawa from the Monogatari series. So that's a good aside to point out. There's plenty of waifus in this show. There's plenty of husbandos, Bishonen boys, that are beautiful and have dashing, flowing hair and are cool warriors and knights and such. It's a very romantic series. Vaughn himself is kind of a brash, reckless jerk in the beginning, but he learns to confide more in Hitomi's powers, and the two get closer and closer, and a love story blooms. We have a love triangle between her, Vaughn, and this dashing knight named Alan Shazar from another kingdom, who's supposed to shack up with this other princess, but Hitomi ends up falling for him, and so the story goes places interpersonally. There's sort of a shoujo romance element running through this steampunk mecha war story. So you have all of the like action fantasy elements you would want, but you also have all this romance and all these feelings that these characters carry on through this whole thing, and even childhood friend of Vaughn, Catgirl Merle, is always playfully scheming against Hitomi because she's attached to him, and it's fun stuff. There's a lot of light comedy is derived from that to kind of balance out the darker, grittier, edgier elements of the villains, who are all great, especially Vaughn's brother, who I won't spoil too much, but he's a great, interesting caped villain that comes in the story. And Delando, who is kind of the more maniacal, cackling guy in the story, who has his own interesting development later in the show. And even like the familiar fantasy elements are not overly familiar. You know what I mean? They're not like overly generic or whatever. Even like dragons and mystical powers and sorcery is depicted in a really interesting and unique, rich way in this show. It looks fantastic. The animation is wonderful. It's Sunrise at the peak of their powers during like the 90s, where really they were one of the few really like wealthy big budget studios that could crank out that stuff. And to me, again, it's one of the most best looking anime of the 90s. Character designs are great, and there's lots of beautiful background art and colors, and the music by Yoko Kanno, one of the best composers in all of anime, and just a great composer, period. Would go on to do stuff like Cowboy Bebop and Ghost in the Shell, and she does the soundtrack, so it sounds incredible. I love the opening theme especially. Gets my heart pumping every time I hear it. And there is a film There is a feature-length, like, movie version of Escaflowne that came out in 2000. It came out a few years later by Sunrise again, had the same director, and more music by Yoko Kanno, but the story suffers big time. So you're not getting as good of a story. It's kind of an alternate telling, very different character designs and art. That looks great. It looks good. It does have more technical animation. So like, you'll get like a lot more Sakuga, I suppose, within the 2 or hour and a half that you watch it. But the story is so condensed and so broken down and simplified that like you're not getting the depth of the characters that are fleshed out in the show. You know what I mean? It's the same characters, but it feels like you're getting a lesser version of the story. You know, there are some like harder edged elements that are kind of neat to see, some differing ideas. Like the character designs are very different. The way they pilot the Guy Malefs is like strangely more metal. Like they have to like use their own blood to fuel them as they're piloting them, and it's like, okay, there's some crazy cool stuff in this movie. There's some like more there's some stuff that like is neat to see if you've seen the show, and it's just like, okay, that's a different like direction to take with this world. But again, the story is like barely there, and if you haven't seen the show, you'll be especially baffled because you won't even know like what the fuller version of these characters in this world is supposed to be. So it just feels like Sunrise kind of doing experimental cool shit with a familiar title, rather than like creating something new from scratch. So the movie's a decent curiosity. Maybe after watching the show, check this out. The show has 26 episodes and is on Funimation now, and totally worth a watch. Even after all these years, it may sound old, 1996, but trust me, it holds up extremely well. And as far as like 90s pre-digitized like paint and coloring is concerned, like this is one of the best examples, one of the most beautiful fluid examples you're going to see of a TV anime production. So check out The Vision of Escaflowne as my recommendation, and I'll see you guys next time. Live for the passion.